Well, when it's time for you to go get a job, I'm just going to recommend to everyone here in this room go get a job that is even in the slightest enjoyable. I recommend that because I've been in a situation in which that was not the case. It's not my current job, obviously. But I had a chance to go get a job wherever I wanted to in college, and I really do regret not getting like a cool job, like a barista or something like that. I could get my friend's coffee. My latte art would be so much better than it is right now. But no, I became a telemarketer at State Farm Insurance, selling car insurance. And this is me here, the American icon, of course, with all of my quote sheets that I was able to compile together. Where basically my job was this: I got a list of names and numbers and addresses, which is kind of crazy that you can just buy that people's information. But anyway, so I'm going through this list, hundreds and hundreds of people on this list, and I have to call them to convince them that they should have State Farm and convince them to think about their car insurance, something that which you probably never ever think of. And so me and a couple friends from school, we basically we worked in the back room of a nail salon. We weren't even in the State Farm office. Like, they bought this like room at the nail salon across the parking lot so that the rest of the world, like clients that would come in, wouldn't see us. Like, that's how back in the corner we were. My highlight of the day was being able to go to the gas station to go get a 69-cent like extra large soda. Like, that was the highlight of my day because it would just be hundreds and hundreds of calls of, hey, I'm going to convince you that you should give me over the phone right now all of your contact information, your make and model of your car, your driver's license number, like all of these like pretty like personal like questions. Like, I'm having to do this over the phone. And so of course I'm in Kentucky. So I'd like, I got the accent. Like, I was like, hey, how's it going? My name is Matt from State Farm. How you doing today? Like, like I was really trying to like lean into it. And I'm going to say like I wasn't super good at it. But it was, I would say, one of the most, no, the most frustrating job I've ever experienced in my life. Come in for 4 hours. I had 4 hour shifts where I would call hundreds of people in 4 hours, one after the other, hang up after another. People being like, hey, stop calling me, take me off your list, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Give me your driver's license. Give me your make and model. It was a very, very pointless job. And I don't know if you ever experienced doing something of which you felt like was extremely pointless and didn't really pay off. I was making $8 an hour, which is like so below minimum wage in California. It was advertised as such a great thing because minimum wage in Kentucky is $7.25. So I was making $75 over minimum wage. So I was rolling in the dough. But anyway, it was not a very enjoyable job. It was not a job that really paid off. It was not a job that I felt like any passion or ambition for at all. It was just a job. And I'm sure you felt that before in school. Have you felt that in school before? Homework assignment after homework assignment. Maybe you have a job. Maybe you work at some place. You have a job, and it just feels like the most boring, pointless, monotonous, stale, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the homework assignment, after the long class period, after one after the other, after the other. You feel like it's pointless. Well, I have good news for you this morning. Good news for you this morning is Ephesians chapter 6. It teaches us this morning that nothing that you do in school, nothing that you do at your job, future career one day is pointless. Everything has eternal ramifications. I'd like you to open up to Ephesians chapter 6 with me this morning. If you feel stuck in that monotonous day after day, school assignment after school assignment, work shift after work shift, and you're looking forward to summer when you don't have to worry about it anymore, I want you to think deeply about your homework. I want you to think deeply about your job if you have a job. It might be boring, but it is not pointless, is what Paul is going to teach us this morning. Every assignment, every class period, every shift, it matters. This week we're continuing here in this section of our how-to series where he's addressing different relationships that you have in this world. We talked about husbands and wives. We talked about children and parents, and now we're talking about slaves and masters, or modern day example, employers and employees, bosses and employees, teachers and students, authority and someone under authority. How those small things that you do in your job, in your school, connecting it really to the big picture, that you are ultimately a slave of God, and therefore that affects every homework assignment, every shift that you have at your work. Let's look at this morning I hope it's an encouragement to you. It's an encouragement to me as we think through the monotonous things that we do every day. Ephesians chapter 6, look at verse 5. It says this. It says, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he's a bondservant or is free. Likewise, masters, do the same to them. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." I think this passage is encouraging for every student in this room, for everyone working a job in this room, to say, what you do, the monotonous, pointless things that you do that you feel like are pointless and monotonous, they matter because you, if you're a Christian, you are a servant of God. That's, I hope, encouraging to you that what you're doing, it matters. Again, we've looked at it matters how husbands treat their wives. It matters how children treat their parents and how parents treat their children. Those things matter. If right now you are under authority, and at school you're under authority, if you work a job, you're under authority, what you ought to do as someone under authority is, it says, to work with this sense of perspective that you are a servant or a slave of God, that you are a Christian everywhere. I want you to think right now about your homework or think about your job. Does the way that you do your job, does it reflect your claim to be a Christian? Real Christians, they do homework than non-Christians. They do it differently. Two completely different relationships to their work, to their assignments, to their shifts at work. It says here that Christian slaves, Christian bondservants, it says that their job is to look back at verse 5. It's to obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. He's talking here in the first century with, again, they had this slavery was very normal in their day and age. It was kind of really the backbone of their society. And right now, when you read a word like bondservants, you read about slaves and masters, you in your mind probably think of USA, probably think of the South, probably think of the Confederacy, and you probably think of the slave trade and every bad thing that goes along with it. And again, that's our American minds, our American perspective that we now have when we come to a text like this. So what is really going on? Slavery, what's going on back in the first century? Well, first of all, just to clarify, it was not a strictly racial discriminatory thing. It was people of all races were slaves, whether you had committed a crime against someone and you were paying back a debt, or whether you got into a financial situation where you had to sell yourself to someone else. Or when a conquering king would come in and take over people, he would make them slaves. So sometimes, I guess it would have to do where you're from, at least country-wise. But it wasn't racial like it was in the United States. And also it's very different too, where there were laws and rules for slaves to then eventually work their way out of slavery, where they could go work to become free. And so that was a little bit different than than the U.S. slave trade that was going on that you read about in your history books. I think when we as Americans read passages like this about slaves and masters, again, we come with that bias, with that perspective that we have from our history books. But I want you to see right here that the fact that Paul is writing specifically to slaves and to masters shows that inherently, in and of himself, slavery is not inherently sinful. It's not inherently condemned or wrong. Because Paul, what he's saying here is that slaves have an obligation, and so do masters. If slavery was wrong, Paul would have said right here, abolish slavery completely. Again, I'm not trying to advocate for let's bring slavery back. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is in this context, in this society, in this culture, he was saying that slaves ought to be Christian slaves and masters ought to be Christian masters, and that will then affect their life. And so now fast forwarding it now to 2024, you in your situation, you're not a slave, though you might feel like it sometimes at school, though you might feel like it when you've got chores to do at the house. You are not a slave. You are free. What does that mean for your life? What does this passage mean for your life? I want you to think right now about your authorities. Most of you in this room are more in this bondservant camp than this master camp. Not many of you are bosses. Not many of you have authority positions. Some of you might be older siblings or whatever, but you're not authority. And so therefore, for you as someone under authority, what does this tell you that you ought to do? If you're under authority, look at what it says, to obey those masters And then look at this, with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, look at this, as you would Christ. You're obeying these people above you as you would Christ. Not by way of eye service, people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So therefore, if you are going to connect your schoolwork, your homework, your work shifts to ultimately what really matters, you have to remember that everything you do, you are working for the Lord. Working for the Lord. And so I want you to think about that mindset as you go to school, as you show up to your work, that you have to have a for the Lord mindset in every area. And so I'd like you to write it in this way for point number one. I want you to adopt an FTL mindset in all workplace settings. FTL, for the Lord. This was the phrase that my old youth pastor used to say all the time. And it's just everything you do, it's FTL, for the Lord. Every schoolwork assignment, every work shift that you have, everything that you're doing is not pointless, is not meaningless. It actually all matters because you are ultimately working for someone way higher than your boss, way higher than your teacher, and even way higher than your parents too. And therefore what he's doing is he gives us perspective. Perspective is so helpful. When you get busy work this week, you don't have to call it pointless. You get to call it meaningful because this is a way for me to obey God ultimately. This is a way for me to please God, to worship him with what I do. Having a perspective of the bigger picture. It helps you when your nose, when your attention is down, bogged down in your circumstance, bogged down in your assignment, bogged down in your homework. It does matter. Every detail does. I want you to think right now about a sculpture, okay? So you got like Michelangelo, like a famous sculptor, famous painter. And he's got this big big sculpture of David. And I was looking at the small little details. Do you see these little details? Like, look down at your hand right now. Look at your hand and like flex your hand back and forth. Those little tendons that you have, those little blood vessels that you have. Look, he's got those. He carved those out of stone. And you think about him in his office or whatever he had, his place of sculpting. He was there and he was looking at his hand and he was looking at his sculpture and he was going back and forth and getting the little blood vessels or the little hairs of your eyebrows or the little furrow right above your eyes where right above your eyes, right above your nose and your eyes where they meet together. Think about how much time he spent looking at nostrils during that time of sculpting. Like, to the smallest of details. The little creases in your eye, your pupils. Look at those details. In those moments of sculpting those little details, he could have said, what am I doing? A little stupid little tendon in the back of this guy's hand. Like, come on. Like, that's ridiculous. Oh, his pupil, the way that his nose furrows above where his eyebrows are, like, that doesn't really matter. But what he said, taking a step back from the whole thing, is no, every single detail of this sculpture, it matters. Therefore, every single assignment, it matters if you zoom out and you look at the whole thing and say, why am I in school? I am in school so that I can please God, so that I can glorify him. Why am I working a job? Every shift, every minute, every order that I take, I must now think, how can I glorify and please God? Because every detail, all the way down to the smallest of details, it matters. You feel those thoughts of school is never going to end. This work shift is never going to end. This period has gone on for so long. I'm over it. I don't like the block periods. I'm just done with it. Every minute in your class matters. Every assignment in your class matters. Look at what he says. He says, your job is you're a servant of God. You're obeying your earthly masters as you would God. So how are you going to work with this FTL mindset practically? If you look at this passage, you see a lot of commas. Do you know what commas translate to? They translate to subpoints. Did you know that? Commas translate to subpoints. So get your pens out. Subpoint A is this. What do you need to do? Bondservants, first thing, obey your earthly masters. Subpoint A, make obedience your default. Make obedience your default with your authorities. With every workplace setting, school setting that you have, obedience is your default, is what you are called to do. The word obey here is the same word that we saw with children obeying their parents. It's a different word than we saw wives submitting to their husbands. It's a completely different word where obedience is very much an authority and someone's subject. to listen under, to take one's commands, to carry out one's orders, to be subject to is the idea. To obey in everything. Colossians 3, very similar passage. It looks very similar to our text. Colossians 3:22 says, bondservants, obey in everything. It adds that adjective, obey in everything. Those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. It looks very similar to our text. But I like that he even qualifies it with this idea of in everything that you do, it's your default. Obey your earthly masters. Are obedient actions your default with your teachers? Ask yourself that question right now. Your default with your teachers, is obedience what you do? Like on the reg? Over and over again? It's just what you're known for? Or is disobedience? This passage says that Christian bondservants, Christian slaves, Christian students, Christian employees are called to their default to obey. Christians should be known for how they obey. You ask your teachers, hey, teacher, is it surprising for you to know that I'm a Christian? Every teacher that you have should say, no, that's not surprising because I see it show up in the way that you treat me. I see it in the way that you carry out my commands, my assignments. Which means that, like we talked about last week, when you obey your parents, your actions must obey all the way, where you're doing fully what they say. Not half obedience. I technically did it. I did most of my homework. No, like did you do all of it? Is homework optional? Is homework a command from your teacher to say, do this now? You need to even treat your homework like I need to do it all the way. I think oftentimes this can happen in school very easily. Well, I'm gonna just try the homework and whatever. Math's kind of hard. So like if I get like 5 of the 10 questions done, whatever, I'll turn something in. What does this say here? Obey your earthly masters until you get tired, until it's late at night, until you don't want to anymore. No, it says obey your masters with this respect of fear and trembling, as you would Christ. Do you obey God halfway? Well, if you don't do that, then you should not obey your teachers, your authorities halfway. I hear this all the time. Oh, but my teachers, they're so dumb. Like my teachers, they don't know what they're talking about. And let me tell you this. I've talked with my parents, and my parents also agree that my teachers are dumb. And so therefore, because of that, I don't need to do it anymore. Have you had that conversation with your parents before? Parents love to bag on their kids' teachers. I'm just going to say it like that. If they were here, I would say it as well. They love to complain about your teachers. And they do it to each other too. They do it to me sometimes, and they definitely do it to you. Do you hear they're complaining about your teachers and say, you know what? Yeah, I get to do the same thing. No, that doesn't. Look at what it says. You are obeying them in fear and trembling. You think, oh, they're not worthy to be obeyed. They're not smart. They're dumb. They're non-Christian, so therefore I'm not going to do it. I want you to see this right here. 1 Peter 2, 18 and 19, it says this. 1 Peter 2, 18 and 19 says, servants, same word, be subject to your masters with all respect. Not only to the good and Gentile, not to just your good teachers that are good to you and that are Christians and all those things, but it says, but also to the unjust, to your bad teachers. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Bad teachers and bad bosses, they're all worthy to be obeyed, is what this text is telling you. Which sounds kind of crazy. That sounds like counterintuitive that, no, but they're bad. They don't know what they're doing. I don't have to obey someone that doesn't know what they're doing. It's really difficult to look at this passage, 1 Peter 2. It's really difficult to look at Ephesians 6 and to find that actual excuse in the Bible. Because you can. I'll talk more about an exception to that in a minute. But when your teacher commands you to do your homework and says do this or carry out this assignment, you do it, and you do it right away. You do it urgently. You do it respectfully. And to think about what we talked about last week, obedience to your parents as an urgent thing, your obedience to your teacher should also be should be an urgent thing, or your obedience to your bosses. To get serious about making sure that you remember what they say. How often do you forget what your teachers say? All the time. Are Christians called to obey their earthly masters until they forget? No, there is an element of you making sure that you remember what they say so that you can then go obey them. See, it'll pay off in the classroom. It will also pay off in your job one day. When you have a job, if you listen to your bosses and you do what they say and you do it urgently, good things are going to happen to you. Actually, I would say great things are going to happen to you. Promotions, all of those types of things will come about to those people that obey right away. They will respectfully, they work hard, they listen the first time. I've been the employee and I've been the boss, and I've seen it on both sides. It does work. Obeying your earthly masters with, look at this, with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. This idea is getting the slave to see their master as someone that is worthy of respect. And so subpoint B, you could write it this way: you need to view your authorities with respect. Which that one feels like, whoa, I don't know about that. Like, you haven't met my teachers. You haven't met my boss. No, it says that, look at, you're obeying them with fear and with trembling. That does not sound cash at all. That sounds very intense. It sounds very difficult. It says with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Fear and trembling communicates this idea of respect, of authority that God has put into place, where you will fear God by the way that you fear, quote unquote, your teachers, the way that you respect them, the way that you view them highly. See, God put those authorities in there, and so for you to resist those authorities, resist those teachers, resist those bosses, are ultimately to resist God, ultimately, because he was the one that put them there. I want you to write down Romans 12. Or Romans 13, sorry, that's a typo. Romans 13, 1 and 2. Romans 13, 1 and 2. Romans 13, 1 and 2 says this: let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been now instituted by God. God was the one that put them there. It says, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Romans 13, 1 and 2. When you complain about your math teacher, regardless of how bad of a teacher they really are in an objective sense, you're complaining about God putting that teacher, putting that boss there in front of you. How do you view your authorities? When push comes to shove, are they in charge, or do you feel like you are in charge? You feel like you know better than them? Again, sometimes you might, not every teacher is a great teacher. I'm not trying to advocate for every teacher as an amazing teacher. But what I'm saying is that if they're in charge, God put them there. And so therefore you have to respect them. Okay, but hold on. Wait a minute. What about when teachers, bosses, want you to sin? Is that the exception? Short answer, yes, that is the exception. Long answer, I want you to see that the way that you even respect them doesn't mean you blindly do what they say every single time, no matter what. God is ultimately your first priority. But for you to complain about them, it's not what you're supposed to do. Look at this. Turn over to Titus chapter 3. I want you to see this. It's got a couple different descriptions than we have in our passage about rulers and authorities. I want you to see it. Titus chapter 3. Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Titus 3, 1 and 2. I want you to see that complaining about your authorities is actually a big deal. Titus chapter 3, context here is he's talking about governing authorities again, political authorities. But I think it's helpful for us to see that so that we know how to interact with our authorities. Titus 3, verse 1, it says this. It says, remind them, referring to Christians, Paul writing to Titus here, who's the pastor, remind your church to be, look at this, submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient. Here's our word. And look at this, to be ready for every good work. This is where it gets really difficult. Verse 2 it says this, Titus 3:2, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Right now, taking this passage, does this describe your relationship with your teachers and bosses, your authorities right now? Where I'm not speaking evil of them, I'm avoiding quarreling, I'm gentle, and showing perfect courtesy towards all people. And in front of them, I'm not in front of them, all the time, I'm submissive and obedient, verse 1, and now I'm in that situation, I'm ready for every good work. Notice the put off and the put ons here. Stop disrespecting, start respecting. Do you see that? So when they tell you to do something, your default is, I'm going to do it. I'm going to obey them. But how far does God want me to do that? Should I sin to respect my authorities? What if they want me to do something that I know the Bible says is wrong? What should I do in that case? Write down Acts 5:29. Context of this is they're preaching the gospel. Peter and others are preaching the gospel, and they're on trial for sharing the gospel, for proclaiming Jesus. And he says this to the political leaders. He says this, Peter and the apostles, they answered, we must obey God rather than men. You should not obey your authorities. This is the caveat. You should not obey your authorities if they are telling you, they're commanding you, they're prescribing you to disobey God, to sin, which happens, frankly, pretty infrequently, but it does happen. It does happen. If your teacher is telling you to cheat, is advocating for you to lie, you should not do that. Why? Because your ultimate authority, your ultimate master is God, not man. But when those two things don't contradict, you obey man, in this case, the authority that you have. I had this situation one time happen, State Farm, of all places, like where my boss was like saying, hey, just lie on your timesheet. Like just put more hours than you really did. Just write this down, like act like you did more and then you'll get paid more or whatever. In those situations, I had to say, no, boss, I'm going to not do what you say because that's not right, because I know what the Bible says about that over here. So those situations, those will happen. They're not super frequent. But they do happen. And so it's important for you to see that you need to obey God rather than men if those contradict. But if they don't contradict, you obey your authority. So that's the one caveat to this command here to obey. So back to our passage. He goes on to explain the how, the attitude that you must have. He says, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. And then he says this. He says, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ. What is he trying to get us to say here? Subpoint C, right on this way. Fight for sincere motives. Fight for sincere motives. A sincere heart is the idea that you are seeking to ultimately please God. That's your priority here. Sincere heart. The word sincere is this idea of singular, this idea of pure or simple, no ulterior motives. I'm going to do this, obey my teacher so that they will do this for me later. No, that's the opposite of what he's trying to say. A sincere heart. How would you obey Christ? Remember, your actions, like we talked about last week with your parents, is not good enough. Your respect and your attitude and your actions, that's what is the secret sauce. So what does he say here? He says, not by way of eye service as people pleasers. What is this idea of eye service? This word eye service is the idea that you are obeying to make an impression on your boss or teacher or something like that, to then get something out of them, to impress them in their presence in order to be seen. I'm going to do this in front of their face so that they see me, and then the opposite of that is not doing it when they don't see me. Working when the teacher's in the room, not working when the teacher's not in the room. The idea is you're deceiving them, flattering them, impressing them to get something out of them. I want you to think right now about when your teacher walks out of your classroom. What do you do when your teacher walks out of your classroom? I remember my classes was like so many people. It was loud, goofing off. Everyone pulls out their phones. I remember the worst was I was in chem one day, and my teacher walked out of the room while we were taking a class, like a test, taking a test. And then literally she walks out of the room. Everyone in the room is like, well, question number one, what did you get? Did you get C's? Like, people were literally interacting with each other, like group projecting our test. It was terrible. And I thought, you would never do this when the teacher's in the room, but when the teacher's out of the room, it's the Wild West. You can do whatever you want. That's not what Christians do. That's eye service. Only doing it when they're in front of you and not doing it when they're not looking. Look at this word. He says, like a people pleaser. Look at this shallow motivation. Someone that is so thirsty for approval from your boss, from your authority, that you just want them to like you so bad. And so you're just going to like do what they want to do in front of them so that they like you. He says those are shallow motivations, that it doesn't work, is displeasing to God. Look what Paul says about people pleasers in Galatians 1:10. He says, "For now, am I seeking the approval of man or of God? If I were trying to please man, or am I still trying to please man, rather? For if I were trying to please man," he says, "I would not be a servant of Christ." Why does he say that? Because when you don't serve God with your motives, with your actions, and you're seeking to please someone else, you have now created a different God, where you're not serving the God where your motives should be pure, undefiled for him, seeking to obey him. It's a big deal when you think about the way that you interact with your teachers when they're in front of you, like you're in front of their face, and when you're behind their back. You need to choose to please God in all timing, in all areas. And then look at this. He reminds you in verse 6 what you are. He says, "You are a bondservant, a slave of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with goodwill as to the Lord and not to men." What he's saying here is that everything that you do, you've got to make sure God is your number one priority. Subpoint D, make God your number one priority. In every assignment, in every shift that you have, making God your number one priority. He says your identity is you are a bondservant of Christ. That changes your homework. That changes your work ethic. That changes your job. You are a slave, a doulos of Christ, is what he says. If you're acting like a Christian just at church and not at school, not with your teachers, not with your homework, not at your job, you're misrepresenting Christ. Because you carry his name. Look at this. You are a bondservant, a slave of him in every area of your life. I want you to think right now, if you are the son of Walt Disney, you are Walt Disney Jr. I don't know if that was his son's name. Didn't look it up. Didn't really care. But let's just say you're Walt Disney Jr. And your dad, he gets you a job at Disneyland. Okay, so Walt Disney Jr. from Anaheim, California, he goes and he gets a job at Disneyland. What do you think that conversation between Walt Sr. and Walt Jr., what do you think that conversation is like? Walt Sr. is probably like, "Hey, you have the last name Disney. Therefore, what you do, it's a reflection of me. It matters. Your family name should affect your work ethic when you are working at the monorail." I don't know why monorail. The guy that sits in the little cockpit and does nothing with his life, just sits there and gets paid a bunch of money. I don't know what he does. It's all robotic anyway. So monorail guy, okay? Walt Disney Jr. is a monorail guy. You are reflecting the name Disney in every area, in every job, in every conversation. Why? Because your name badge is right there on your chest. See, your dad, Walt Disney, would say, "You need to respect me, your dad, so much where I am above your bosses." Like, Walt's up at the top, then you got your boss over here at the monorail manager, and then there's you down here. Like, okay, you obey monorail manager here, but ultimately, you're obeying me up top, Mr. Disney. That's who you really are reflecting. That's who you are really honoring. So make sure you do my will. Look at what it says, doing the will of God from the heart, your sincere heart to please God, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to men. God is your boss at all times. God is your teacher, quote unquote, at all times. How are you reflecting that relationship? You've got his last name, bondservant of Christ. You are, not that your last name is Christ, but like you are, he has his name on you. Therefore, you're reflecting him at school, at your job, from the heart. Sincere motives to please God. Look at this. Deuteronomy 10:12-13 says this. "And now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord, to walk in his ways, to love him," and look at this, "to serve the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord which I'm commanding you today for your good." What is your job? It's to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That changes every work assignment that you are given. To the Lord and not to man. How can I please God today? Paul says this way, 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. Are you doing your schoolwork to the glory of God? Are you doing your work shift to the glory of God? Is he your number one priority? Reflecting him in hard work, in honest work, in on-time work, in kindness, in a good attitude. sincere from the heart to please God. And then look what he says here in verse 8. He says, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he's a bondservant or is free. So no matter who he is, a master or a slave, he is going to receive eternal rewards. Subpoint E, remember your eternal rewards. Remember your eternal rewards. You will receive it back, is the phrase here. Every late night of doing long homework where you don't go online and find and cheat and get the answers, where you do your hard, honest work, do you really believe that God sees it? Do you really believe that on Judgment Day you will answer to God for how you did that assignment? Honestly, I hope that's great news to you. That's scary news in one sense, but that's also great news in another sense to say, man, what I'm doing, it actually matters. I'm not wasting my time. What if this week when you get homework, what if you treat every homework assignment like this is not a waste of time? Now, doing fill in the blank. Chem. Okay, I mentioned chem before. Chemistry. Like, is chemistry pointless? Don't talk with Jason you about it, but like honestly, it kind of is in most areas of life. Honestly, Jason would agree with that. He actually totally would agree with that. So does it really matter? No. But does what you do in that class really matter? Yes, it does. Everything does. Every homework assignment does. And I hope that that's helpful motivation for you to say, you know what, this week I'm going to work hard on that. I'm going to make sure that I don't cheat. I'm going to make sure that I don't copy off my friend's paper. I'm going to do the work. I'm going to be honest, hardworking. I'm going to turn it in on time. I'm not going to turn it in late because I know that whatever good I do as a student, as a worker, as an employee, I'm going to receive it back from the Lord. Write down Colossians 3:23 through 24. He says this, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive an inheritance as your reward, for you are serving the Lord Christ. Do you really believe that verse right there? Do you really believe it? Then you'll stop being lazy with your homework. You will stop being lazy at your job if you really believe that. If you don't believe it, go out and live the rest of the week like you did last week. Go out and cheat on your homework again if you really don't believe it. But if you do believe it, live it. Work like it. I want you to be encouraged that your homework has meaning. We don't have small groups this week like normal because we got year-end party, but there is a homework assignment on the back for you to just take a look at this sermon and say, how am I going to actually put it into practice in my life with my authorities? What can I do to make sure that God is my number one priority, to make sure that I work hard, to make sure that I obey my earthly masters with sincere motives, with respect, all of those things. See, most of you are in this stage right now of being the one under authority, but he also talks to the people who are over top of you, that are in the authority. Look at this, verse 9. When you get authority one day, what should you do with it? He says this, verse 9, masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. This is helpful for every master, for every leader, for every authority in your life, that they are to remember that they have to lead with this sense of humility and deference ultimately to God. So point number 2, write down this way, when you receive authority, you need to lead with humility. When you receive authority, lead with humility. The idea here is masters. He doesn't say, masters, go free all of your slaves because slavery is wrong. He says, masters, do the same to them. Treat those slaves with respect, with honor, not threatening them, but knowing that their master and the master's master is in heaven and he will judge everyone. There's a humility that every leader has to lead with. What does he mean by verse 9 when he says, do the same to them? What is the same? What is he referring to here? Some people go back and forth of how many verses it goes back. But most people say, if you look back at verse 6, it says this. It says, but as bondservants of Christ. Most people will agree that probably he's referring to that phrase on, that you are now a bondservant of Christ. doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with goodwill as to the Lord and not to men, and knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive it back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or he is a master, is the idea. Masters need to have this sincere motive to please God. What he's saying here is that masters have a master. Masters will answer to the master, capital M master, one day before God. And it's a reminder for every master, every leader to say what pleases God. You know, every Christian leader, every Christian CEO, every Christian pastor will have to make sure that the way that they lead is in alignment with these principles here. That it is ultimately for God, that it pleases God, not for impressing people, not to power or money or any of those other motives. Power is not a license to just be prideful. It's actually an opportunity to be humble, to be a servant, to lead, of course, but then also to remember that I need to please God in everything that I do. Look what he says. He says, stop your threatening. Clearly this was going on with some of the Christian masters. They were threatening their slaves, which was not okay. Using their power for selfish gain is the idea. Threatening, do this or else I'm going to do that to you. That's threatening. He says, don't do that. Lead with a sense of humility. Don't be harsh. Don't be overbearing. We don't have a ton of passages to the masters because most of these churches had a lot of slaves and very few masters in the church. They had some, obviously, so they would talk to masters. But the most talked about leaders in the Bible, in the New Testament specifically, is the leaders at the church. And specifically, I want you to see this passage. You don't need to turn there, but you write down 1 Peter 5. 1 Peter 5, 2 and 3 describes the way that church leaders, the principles in which they should lead. And I think this is helpful for us to see that this, in many ways, it has far-reaching application for any time that you have authority. Not the same way, of course. He says this, verse 2, shepherd the flock of God, which is among you. That's not necessarily, for everyone, but pastors, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. Look at what this is, exercising oversight, not under compulsion. Compulsion is the idea of, do this, you better do this, like, you have to do this. But he says, but willingly, as God would have you do. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. What do you see here in these highlighted phrases here? That it's not under compulsion, that it's not for shameful gain, and then it's not domineering over those in your charge. That's how leaders are supposed to lead, specifically church leaders, but really apply to all leaders. Setting the example and not being overbearing about it. When you get leadership one day, whatever situation that might be, you need to keep this in mind. Look at this, because you know that the capital M master is in heaven, and he's the slave's master, and he's the master's master. Both the slave and the master will have to answer to the same boss one day. That's a scary thing, a sobering thing for every master, every boss, every leader. I read this text, and I read it with a sense of seriousness as not a slave master, hopefully not, but as a leader, as an authority, as a pastor, as a boss, where I'm going to answer to God one day, and he's going to judge me for how well of a boss I was, how well of a pastor I was. I will answer for every single person in this room one day before God. And that's scary, but that's also good because it helps me now think about everything that I do, that I'm ultimately accountable to the boss of all bosses. Bad masters will be accountable to God. Bad teachers will be accountable to God. Bad presidents, bad leaders in this world will be accountable to God. And that's a good thing. Think about slave masters. Again, you probably picture the U.S. slave trade, and you think about the masters and the terrible beatings that they would do to their slaves and the terrible atrocities and stories that you read in your history books, and you say, man, that was bad. And yes, in many ways it was bad. But when you look at pictures like this, when you read stories about masters like this, remember that every master is going to stand before the master, and they will experience punishment and judgment for what they have done. And if you're not a master, that's a good reminder for you. Okay, I know that even if my boss, even if my teacher is not the greatest, they're going to answer to God one day, so like God can take care of it. I don't have to take care of it. God cared about slaves. He cared about masters treating their slaves well. Look at this, Exodus 21, verse 20. It says, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. There shall be justice to take place for slave masters that treat their slaves wrongly. They will experience judgment on Judgment Day. So if you are not in authority right now, what do you need to do at this point? Again, you wrote down the word humility. I want you to cultivate humility right now, today, in your life. Stop with your pride and start to be humble. Start to serve other people well. And I want you to kind of mini practice this in every authority that you've been given. If you are leading a team, or you're the captain of your sports team, or you're a group project leader, or you're a babysitter, or even in some ways, if you're an older sibling, if you've been left in charge of your younger siblings, if you serve in Kidsmen and Pastor Nate gives you authority to then have over these kids, or you serve at Camp Compass, if you're in authority, make sure that you are humble, you're not overbearing. You do what this text tells you to do in terms of what a leader, what a master is supposed to do. So I do hope that as we've been able to talk through your relationships, future relationships, capital R relationships, like with the husband and wife, your relationship with your parents, or your relationship with your bosses, with your teachers, with your authorities right now, that you make sure that your life reflects one that is really a Christian. So from Ephesians 5:22 all the way down to Ephesians 6 verse 9, how to live like a Christian in every one of these areas. I hope that you are currently living that way, or future marriage-wise will live that way. I want my life to follow what God wants me to do, whatever role, whatever situation, whatever relationship that might be. I want to make sure that my life is changing, that I'm looking more like Jesus every day in these areas. So that's how to be a worker. Let's pray right now as we head out for this week. Going to be workers, students, employees, and bosses as well. Let's bow our heads and pray. God, we thank you so much for caring for us enough to give us texts like this, where it looks a lot like real life. What do we need to do in our situations of authority and submission? How should we live? How should we submit? How should we obey? God, thank you for this convicting reminder. I do hope that every student right now that is feeling conviction over their homework, over their teachers' relationships, over their relationship with their boss, God, I pray that conviction would yield fruit, would yield repentance, where students would see their sin as gross and disgusting and ugly, and they would repent of it and turn to what your word tells them to do, to honor with his sincere heart, to respect, to obey, and to ultimately do all of these things with this mindset of I'm a servant of Christ, I'm a slave of God, and therefore that's going to affect my relationship with my bosses and with my teachers. So God, thank you so much for this reminder today. Pray that it make a difference in our lives this week. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.